Well, today is Monday, July the 7th, 2025, and I'm here in New Haven, Connecticut with Dr. Thomas Murray from Yale University. Welcome, Tom. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, sir.
Really good to see you on this hot and humid day.
Well, that's true, but the air conditioning indoors is
The air conditioning is
very refreshing.
yeah. So I understand that you're a California boy,
That's right.
born and bred in Los Angeles. And
Yes.
talk to me a little bit about that.
My parents had lived in California since 1926. They were married in 1926, and I did not appear until 1943.
Okay.
I have no brothers or sisters, so I suppose you could say that I was something of the spoiled, older, empty child.
Right.
And
Only child.
yes, only.
Yeah.
My parents were always very, very encouraging about my interests. And I took some piano lessons like everyone really should,
Mhm.
because piano, of course, teaches you the topography of the keyboard that you're going to be playing when you play the organ.
Sure.
But I was captivated by the organ oh, goodness. I'm going to say by the time I was in 8th grade.
Is that right?
Right.
What exposure did you have with the organ at that point?
I heard it in church.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
And there were other advantages that I was fortunate to have too, because there was a choral group called the Pasadena Boy Choristers, and its founding director, Dr. John Henry Lyons, was the director when I auditioned and was accepted into the choir.
Now, how about that?
Yeah.
We have something in common. I'm an only child, and I was in a boy choir when I was young,
Yes.
and I was also attracted to the pipe organ when I was in 8th grade.
Right.
How about that?
Well, there was a pivotal experience when the choir sang for a society wedding in Pasadena at All Saints Episcopal Church. And the organist was a wonderful old Scotsman by the name of James Shearer. And when he let loose on the wedding march, something clicked and said, "This is what you want to do, isn't it?"
Yeah.
And so that was sort of the beginning.
Right.
And then by the time I was a freshman in high school, I took organ lessons in the town where I lived. And a wonderful teacher by the name of John Stewart. He was one of those all-purpose, all well-rounded musicians. He taught voice, he taught piano, he taught organ. And in his church, there was a very lovely Aeolian Skinner, small, 17 ranks, 1952, I think. And so I was able to have my lessons on that organ. I was also able to rent practice time at 50 cents an hour.
Wow. How about that? And this was the time in pop culture where, the Beach Boys and all of that was
Who were they?
happening in the California sun.
Right.
But
Well, I remember, of course, from a distance, from a safe distance, Elvis Presley. And I remember that song that appeared on 45 RPM discs, The Witch Doctor.
all right.
Do you remember The Witch Doctor?
Yeah, do I know?
Oh, well, it was about that time in the 50s.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you were studying organ all through high school
Yes.
and went to college. What was your intent when you went to college? What were you intending to study?
Well, it's an interesting sort of thing because everyone, including my mother and father, could see that I was very keen on organ playing. And they knew that it would be possible for me to go to one of the conservatories, maybe something on the East Coast even. But they were concerned even then about the viability of a profession, an occupation in classical music.
Right.
And they also, I think, although they never quite said this, I think that they were a little worried that my great passion for playing the organ might burn out. So we sort of put our brains together. And there's a school that's very well respected in Los Angeles, Occidental College. And it's a liberal arts college, a small liberal arts college.
In Los Angeles.
Yes. And they felt very rightly that this would be a wise choice, because in case my burning passion were to wear out. I would have a liberal arts education. I would graduate with a Bachelor of Arts degree.
Something to fall back on
Yes. But
in case.
yeah, in case. Well, it's wise to think in terms of in case. Sure, it really is.
Obviously.
No, you have to remember. I entered college in 1960, and in the 1950s and the early part of the 60s, people still went to church in great numbers.
Right.
So it didn't occur to me that there might be a period such as the period we are seeing now and have seen for the past 30 years,
Oh, man.
where support by churches of classical music might not be very strong, and there would be an attrition in terms of church going. But there was a wonderful, I guess I'd call it a coincidence, about Occidental College. It had one of the very best organ professors, organ teachers in all of the West,
Wow.
Clarence Mader.
Yes. Tell me about him.
Well, Mader had been a pupil of the great Linwood Farnham,
Okay.
and he and his family had settled in Los Angeles. He was organist from the time the really magnificent building of Emmanuel Presbyterian Church was open for Manuel Skinner organ.
My goodness.
And he was a legend. He taught David Craighead. He taught Lad Thomas. There are all kinds of wonderful pupils of his. He had an insight with a student as to what that student's existing strong points were and where those weak points were.
Okay.
And so he
was a true educator then.
he was.
Yeah.
He was also a composer.
Mm-hmm.
He was a wonderful painter. He and his wife, Ruth Goodrich Mader, were painters.
Hmm.
He was a Renaissance man. There is a wonderful study on Clarence Mader by someone whom I had to come and lecture on him at Yale, Jacob Benda, Benba.
That name's a bit familiar to me.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, Jacob Benda.
Yeah.
Who did a great study on Clarence. It must have been a doctoral dissertation, I suppose. But now to come back to Mader, I had 4 years of his coaching at Occidental College, 1961 to 65. And by then, my passion had not burned out.
Yes.
And so I began to do recitals. I, fostered a freelance recital career. I was also interested in making recordings. And it's at that point that the relationship with the Organ Historical Society came alive.
Oh.
Because, of course, you're the CEO. The Organ Historical Society was founded in 1954 at the time of an American Guild of Organists convention in New York City. Right. And the founding group met in the choir room at St. Bartholomew's Church in New York City. And that's how it all began.
Right.
Well, I was not around then.
No.
But by the early 1960s, when I had been a student at Occidental and soon thereafter on my own, I rented what was called the slide video, not video exactly, but there was a slideshow that you could rent from the OHS.
No kidding.
It had actual 35 millimeter slides.
Oh my goodness.
And it had a soundtrack. Now, I don't remember who, in fact, I don't think I ever really knew who the narrator was for that. But it would have been one of the early members, people like Donald R. N. Patterson. And you could rent it. They would send it out to you. You had to sign a statement saying that you would protect it and return it and so on. And so I played that for myself. And then I decided this would be a wonderful program for chapters of the American Guild of Organists. And I don't remember just how many places that I brought this slideshow. I didn't have to do the talking. The talking was all with that abstract. I remember doing it at Emmanuel Presbyterian once I had become organist there.
Right, right.
And that was a pivotal moment.
But just press pause on this for just a moment. You did sort of digress just a little bit in your studies. You went on to the choral conducting side of things.
Well, at Occidental College, we not only had Clarence Mader as the teacher of organ, but there was a marvelous man, very widely respected and revered in his day, named Howard Swan. Dr. Howard Swan.
Famous Dr. Swan, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And his glee club at Occidental was famous.
Yeah.
He also taught individual voice lessons, although you remember, this is a liberal arts college, so we didn't have voice majors.
Right.
And I was certainly not an organ major, although
He sort of made it.
did it anyway. But another thing, I told you I rented practice time on the organ that I studied in high school. I was paid 50 cents an hour to accompany voice lessons for Dr. Swan.
Oh, my goodness. Oh,
yes.
And did you study conducting with him?
Yes.
My goodness.
Yes.
You are now the Renaissance man.
Well, I don't know. Renaissance is rather impressive to say. I wouldn't claim that exactly. But yes, that was an important part of my background. And chorally, the other side of that coin was having been a boy treble in Pasadena Boy Choristers. That was not a church-run group. Although Dr. John Henry Lyons, its founder, was organist and music director in an Episcopal church where he had a boy choir.
Right.
But those two things shaped my interest in Owen. And in college, in a church music course, hearing the recordings of some of the famous English choirs, like King's College and the Temple Church.
Right. Right.
So my interest was strong in both areas, but it was sometime later that I was able to function as a choir trainer. And I did that with great pleasure in Boston at a later time.
I find that the people in the arts, particularly music, who have gone on to success either as performers or educators or whatnot, have had at least one mentor, one transformational person in their life who had a profound effect.
Right.
And I guess that Clarence Mader was that person for you.
He certainly was, but I shouldn't forget John Stewart, who, again, was a Renaissance musician. He taught, as I said, voice, piano, and organ. He had been, I should have said this, he had been a student of Clarence Mader at an earlier time and was Clarence's assistant organist at Emmanuel Presbyterian.
And you eventually succeeded Mader at Emmanuel. How was that transition? How did that?
Well, Clarence had spent all of his life playing in church, and he got to the point where he wanted to have some Sundays free.
I don't know what that feeling is like.
Are you serious?
No.
So it happened. I was very grateful for that opportunity, of course. And it happened rather naturally.
Okay.
But at Emmanuel, I did not try to direct any choral music at all. We had a choir director who was a doctoral candidate at University of Southern California.
Okay.
And so that was very beautifully taken care of.
Well, that's lovely. How long were you at Emmanuel then?
From New Year's Day, 1966, until I retired from that. Not retired because I was scarcely of an age to retire, but I left that position in 1973. Now that is going to bring us back to the Organ Historical Society slideshow.
Okay, good.
Because the truly winning organ that was featured on that program, and I'm not saying that it was the only one that was a winning instrument, because there were quite a few, but the Church of the Immaculate Conception in Boston, the Big Oak. So before leaving California, I made trips back east. I met Barbara Owen.
Mm-hmm.
I saw Immaculate Conception.
Right.
I saw other hook organs, including the Simmons organ, W.B.D. Simmons at Holy Redeemer in East Boston,
Okay.
on which I later recorded. The Jamaica Plain Unitarian Church, 1854 hook organ, Opus 171. And I thought, well, first of all, I want to make recordings on these instruments because there had not been any commercial recordings of serious organ music.
Mm.
E. Power Biggs had come out with a delightful and very entertaining recording called The Organ in America.
You remember that? I don't.
It was Columbia.
Okay.
And he made arrangements of some very early American tunes that were generically keyboard tunes. And Biggs narrated on that recording, The Organ in America. But they were all lightweight pieces. There was nothing that would show that great romantic organ pieces by Franck, by Liszt, by Mendelssohn. There was nothing in his production that really went in that direction.
So you wanted to fill that hole.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And my favorite repertoires include romantic music.
Right. Right.
So I finally made the move and settled in an apartment in Newburyport, Massachusetts, where later Barbara Owen lived.
Right. Right.
She let me practice on the organ at her church.
Wow.
The first religious society,
Okay.
Unitarian,
Right.
of Newburyport. And I always remember the times that I had there practicing, preparing. And then I made arrangements with Father Gilday, who was the pastor of Immaculate Conception, and paid a recording engineer to record on site.
Mm-hmm.
The recording engineer who was in charge of it was a man with a fascinating history. His name was Stephen Fassett.
Okay.
And he had a lovely house where I went later to do the editing. But he needed to have someone else younger to climb up into the organ and hang the microphones. And that person was, oh dear, it'll come.
Yeah.
I know it perfectly well.
Right.
He was a recent Harvard graduate. So Griesinger, David Griesinger.
Okay.
So we spent 2 nights recording. I paid the church, of course, a contribution.
Sorry.
And then I would go to Stephen Fassett's house where he would edit. Now, what was editing like in those days? It was an Ampex tape recorder with magnetic tape.
You get the sharp knife out and
moving at 15 inches per second. This was how it was done.
Right.
Biggs owned one of those big Ampexes, and he went on many a tour in Europe to record using that machine.
Wow.
He was helped, by the way, by Peggy, his wife, and he did his own editing. But what I remember about my afternoons with Stephen Fassett was that I remember 2 or 3 things that stuck in my mind. And they are examples of what the procedure was like with magnetic tape. The first thing was that he didn't use razor blades because they are likely to have magnetism. He used very sharp plastic blades. And whereas splice was done, it was done across the tape at an angle. And then 3M tape to put it together. And then he would run over this several times. He makes the splice. And by the way, there had to be splices, not only for any errors that I made, and there were errors, but we were very near Boston City Hospital, and the ambulance signals and police signals were picked up.
What's your favorite part about doing a recording? What would you really, really enjoy?
Well, it's been a while since I've done one, but doing it. And I was always very careful to choose organs that I was in love with,
Sure.
and was appropriate for the music, but that I had a personal attachment.
Right. Now,
Yeah, but I want to go back to Stephen Fast.
oh yeah, sure.
One of the times that I was editing with him, he told me that Joan Baez edited her first recordings.
How about that?
Can you believe?
I can.
Yeah.
I can. How about that?
Yeah, and it's something else.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned Barbara Owen.
Oh, yes.
What was she like? What was your relationship with her over the years?
Oh, Barbara, it's hard to put that in words, except that she was a very generous person, very philosophical. When she thought that I had some sort of idea that wasn't very good, she would say so, but always, with a guiding intelligence and also intuition.
Mm-hmm.
She was quite amazing. She was one of quite a few illustrious people. Another one that I met in those days was Ed Modway.
Right.
Now, Baudry, I think, was a president of OHS at some point.
At some point, yeah.
That's right. Yeah. In order, Immaculate Conception, which was César Franck, it was the Grande Pièce Symphonique and the Fantasy in A. The first recording at Jamaica Plain Unitarian, because the organ was so perfect as something from the Mendelssohnian period and being very British from the mid-Victorian period. Perfect for Mendelssohn. So I recorded 3 of the sonatas there, and the next album was on that Simmons organ I mentioned.
Yes.
Quite boldly voiced in the big Catholic church. And I think after that, the Johnson organ at St. Mary's in the North End of Boston.
Right.
From there on, it blurs. It blurs in my memory.
Right.
We did, you'll know well about this, but we did the documentary of Hook organs, beginning with the very first George Hook organ that is in the Essex Institute, one manual. And I had narrators to describe the organ and the music. So Barbara Owen narrated that. The next organ was 1840 in Northfield, Massachusetts. That was narrated by Ed Bodway. There was the 1849 two-manual G compass Hook organ in Hinsdale, Massachusetts.
My goodness.
And all of these, of course, in due course, received OHS citations.
Sure.
And Bob Newton, who's sadly no longer with us, but he narrated that one. These instruments that I've just described were all pre-Civil War. And then, again, my memory of the chronology is a little hazy.
Well, it's pretty good in my book.
The OHS played a very large role in introducing me to these organs that I would never have known.
Sure. That's great. Now, so you Occidental College, you went to the place in Newburyport. How did you get to Yale?
Well, let's not skip over St. Paul's on Tremont Street in Boston, because I was hired, first of all, as an interim, but it later became semi-permanent, I guess you could say, at the Episcopal Cathedral. Now, people should not try to imagine this as a great soaring Gothic, St. Paul's Cathedral was a parish church established in 1820, facing Boston Common. Why was such a thing established? Well, it was the first Episcopal parish of American foundation, because the older ones all had ties with the British Empire. King's Chapel, right? Christchurch, Salem Street, which the public at large knows as the Old North Church, even though it isn't. That's not its proper name. So St. Paul's was made a parish. It had doors on the pews. The pews were owned by the proprietors of St. Paul's Church.
Okay.
And then decade after decade went by and the neighborhood changed. There was a great fire in Boston in 1872 that ended that neighborhood for being anything like residential.
Mm.
And so in 1912, it was made the cathedral to save it from death, from extinction.
Okay.
And as long as the bishop, which in the earliest days was Bishop William Lawrence Sr., as long as he got along with deans who were the administrators of it, things went well. But I came there in 1973, as I mentioned, when I moved. It didn't, and we had a wonderful men and boys choir, which I worked very hard to polish.
Mm-hmm.
And it was after school rehearsal time only, which is not ideal.
Mm-hmm.
But I had good support
Mm-hmm.
from the dean,
Mm-hmm.
the good dean. But then there was a complete change of regime, and they weren't going to spend money on classical British cathedral style, collegiate style music.
Oh.
And it was very clear that the end would come at some point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And a little bit before that time, I had played a recital at Yale in Wolsey Hall at the invitation of Charles Kriegbaum, who was,
Okay.
and Charles Kriegbaum was featured on an OHS recording, a 2-disc recording in a live program.
Well,
1975, was it?
Okay.
And it probably still exists on a CD. In any case, he was a brilliant performer, and he led the charge in favor of the Wolsey Skinner organ because he felt that given the organ and the acoustical setting,
Mm-hmm.
that it was a fine vehicle for the symphonies of Charles-Marie Widor.
Mm.
Now, those recordings were made live by the engineer Scott Kent, who used to go around at every OHS convention and record the recitals, the formal full-length recitals.
Or in the way that our Ed Kelly does today.
Yes. I think Ed Kelly was the one who followed Scott Kent. Scott Kent had his own company called AFTA Recordings. But in any case, Charles Kriegbaum had heard me play and invited me down to play a program in Wolsey. And at that time, there were 2 organ professors, both of them of senior caliber. There was Charles Kriegbaum and there was Dr. Robert Baker.
Okay.
And I guess they liked what they heard. And I was quite astonished. At the very time it seems that there was no future at St. Paul's in Boston, I was astonished to get a call from Charles Kriegbaum saying, Yale, is going to advertise a junior position, very junior, on the faculty. But he said, I'd like you to apply.
So you did.
Yes, I applied and I was interviewed and I gave a lecture recital, not in Wolsey, but on the Beckereth organ in Whitechapel. So I've always been very grateful to Charles, also to Robert Baker, and needless to say to Clarence Mader for starting me off. And so I joined the faculty in 1981. And things have gone on more or less the same. I've done a little bit of choral conducting at Yale, but Yale is very competitive when it comes to choral groups. And you have all of these student-run groups like the Whiffenpool.
Yes.
And there came a time rather soon where I thought, I'm going to concentrate on the organ, which was in the end the wise choice. I retired in 2019.
Okay.
So I should also say that I think that one of the reasons that the junior position in organ was advertised back in 1981 was that they were preparing for the retirement of Robert Baker, who did retire soon after.
So this was a transition kind of
Right. But we overlapped.
right.
And I have wonderful memories of Robert Baker. Funny man, just delightful and full of wisdom for his students.
Now, I don't know if this is appropriate to say, but not every organist slash performer would make an ideal educator. What was it about your background, and what influences did Clarence Mader and John Stewart have on your pedagogy?
A major influence, absolutely major. I remembered their methods for teaching. I remember their words of wisdom. I remembered, in many cases, their patience with me. And so I just tried to remember all of those things and discern what the job was to be done at any given moment. And say, well, this is what I think I ought to advise the student to do. And
Okay, so many of your students have gone on to great success in their own careers. Can you point to any sort of common personality trait amongst them, or is it just everyone is like a snowflake?
well, the common trait would be the ones who have done really well in a pragmatic sense. They love performing. They love performing. Now, performing has many aspects. Some of them have aspired to a primarily recital playing, concert playing career. Others have aspired to be an effective church musician. And in many cases, those people, of course, have also taken up choral conducting.
Right.
And they have their own idols of whom they emulate.
Right.
There's somebody I should not leave out of this picture as far as choral music. But he also pertains to the story of recital playing. That was Dr. George Falmon Ball of the Temple Church in London. And his recordings of his choir are unique in terms of their musical style and perfection. And when I did go to England and had the opportunity to meet him, he was very, I would say, welcoming and grandfatherly.
Okay.
To me. He let me watch rehearsals.
Oh. You learn a lot just from being at a rehearsal.
You certainly do.
Yeah. Sometimes even more than when you are participating as a chorister. Right?
Yeah. Well, I never sang in any group that he conducted, but his group, the one group, was the Temple Church, the choir. More trebles, men, altos, basses, tenors. But then he would train in rehearsal. He would train the choir to sing things in the style that he wanted. And then he would walk up the stairs to the organ, and downstairs there would be 2 rows, men, boys, men. And he delegated one person on each side to convey the signals.
Right.
And there wasn't a lot of hand waving at all.
Right.
It was all very discreet, and he watched them through a mirror. There is on YouTube, hope they haven't taken it down, a live television program, filmed in black and white, called Temple Church Choir Rehearsal in 1958.
Oh my. I want to look for that.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's definitely worth seeing.
Right.
Yeah.
But let me ask you, is there an instrument somewhere in the United States or beyond that you were wanting so much to play or record on or do a recital that you didn't get to do that in your career?
Oh, well, no, that's an interesting thing, because I don't remember any serious disappointment. I was blessed beyond measure having access to the Wolsey Hall Skinner. No, I wouldn't say that. And my love for the romantic type of electronegatic organ sort of grew as a natural thing. You know, there was a time when there were the Tracker Packers, the electromagnet people.
Right, right.
It's all music. If you approach this with a sensible, universal attitude about what music is worthy of being enjoyed, what the organs are.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to go back to one other thing, and that has to do with the citations, the RHS citations.
Right.
It has been a wonderful idea. It has saved a good many organs from being discarded. We have now, however, a very difficult time because some of those citations were handed by Michael Barone or by somebody, by you, to someone representing the church, and they see this and they say, we had no idea that our organ had some importance.
Right.
But then those people grow older and older, and the church
or move away.
Yes, or move away, and the church becomes smaller and smaller, and styles of worship change. And in many cases, the first step along that path is when they discover they can't find an organist to play these instruments. And so this is a real worry for every one of us. I know it is for you.
It is very much.
And all people who have their eyes open.
Right. And, with that particular program, it's not something that one can police.
No.
There's no army behind us and saying that you must,
Of course not. You can't force the owner of something to care for it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Especially if their frame of mind has changed to a point where they say this is something from the past, but it has no relevancy for us.
Right. Right.
So I lie awake at night and I worry about this.
Well, we do have the citation program that has morphed into the National Registry for Historic Organs, and we have a number of people who are making application for that. So it's still out there.
Yes,
it's still out there and being robust. Now, you had something to do with a video regarding the Wanamaker organ.
Well, that was purely the invitation, a very kind invitation from the Friends of the Wanamaker to collaborate with Peter Conti on demonstrations of the organ.
Okay.
And I think one of them is called an Organ Odyssey or something like this.
Right.
And I do some of the playing, but most of the playing appropriately is done by Peter.
Right.
But I stand by the console and then we have a conversation.
Okay.
And I might say, let us hear all of the stops of the string division or whatever. And then sometimes he takes the lead and he'll say, well, here are the solo reeds. And they wrote a script for another one. The one that we did first was ad lib on his part and on mine. But then later, the producer, I guess I can call him the producer, Evan Jones of the videos. Okay. Between him and Ray Biswanger, the head of the Friends of the Wanamaker, created a script, and then I would sit down in front of a microphone and read the script. We've done that twice, but on those, I think I'm right in saying that I didn't do any of the playing. The person who plays that organ is destined to do it. With the great brilliance that I've ever witnessed is Peter Conti. And of course, now we're all wondering, the Friends still exist,
right? Yeah.
I believe they still are able to pay for maintenance on the organ.
Yeah.
But there's a great deal
of uncertainty here.
Very great deal of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And that needs to survive.
Yeah, it does. It does. Well, I mentioned earlier that I had the great pleasure and honor of speaking to Orthodoxy in California at her residence last fall. Can you describe her and your relationship with Orpha?
Well, she remembers me when I was whippersnapper, an organ whippersnapper. She was organist of First Congregational Church in Pasadena.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that she had come to California from Missouri, and she may, in fact, be a Missouri native.
Yeah.
So she observed me, perhaps with some alarm, and I observed her and interacted with her with great fascination.
Mm-hmm.
She's
quite a pistol.
Oh, she's ready. I remember when she decided that she would write the history of organ building in the United States. And Clarence was still alive, Clarence Major, and he was already turning a little bit pessimistic about the future of the organ anywhere, but particularly in the United States. But of course, he encouraged her, and my encouragement was, I'm sure, I'm not so sure that it had that much effect, but she wanted to do it. She felt called to do that. So she went to work. And then when things got nearer to publication, she said, I need illustrations. And I had taken a lot of pictures by then of organs everywhere. And there were some things that for which there were no easily available photographs.
Right.
There was a Roosevelt at Schermerhorn Street Evangelical Lutheran in Brooklyn. And I had photographed that. And I think my photograph of the Odell above the Troy Savings Bank in Troy, New York, I think I supplied her with that. But I don't need to make a list. There are some slides in there that were used. And
taking a beautiful picture of an instrument inside a church is an art in and of itself.
Oh, absolutely.
One can't just take a phone in there and hope for the best.
Well, yeah. In those days,
but
we did not use phones. Phones more for talking on and listening on. But that book was published and became, and still is, the cornerstone of research on a large scale.
Right.
For America.
Right.
Barbara then, of course, in due course, followed that with the organ building in New England one, which is very, very detailed. She's taken great pride in her documentation of organs like the Valkyr in Methuen. And she's been fabulous.
Yeah.
But Orca, you have met her. So you know, without having to describe in words, an original thinker, a wonderful writer.
Right.
Yeah.
Someone who takes great joy in everyday life.
Yes.
And is not afraid to stop and smell the roses, but
yes,
knows exactly where she's going.
Right.
Yeah. Even at the ripe old age of 99. What matters? Well, she's 100 now.
He's 100 now.
100 now.
And I should tell you one anecdote.
Yes, please.
It doesn't. Well, it's worth repeating. I don't remember where it was, what house that she was living in when I first knew her, but she went to rent or lease in another place. And when she went to examine this other place, she was accompanied by the landlord, and she immediately pulled out a tape measure and began to measure the height of the ceiling. And he said, "What are you doing that for?" She said, "To see if it's tall enough for the organ and the totem pole." And she did have a pipe organ that she had put together. There were a number of people who would order pipes from the Dutch pipe makers, and then they would build organs on their own using, as amateurs.
Right.
And she had a very nice one that went to this other home alongside it with the totem pole.
So Let's circle back now to your relationship with the OHS, both as a performer but as an educator. What role has the OHS played in your professional life beyond the slide show that you had mentioned?
Yes, well, the slideshow was a really early thing, and uh, you know, the publications, the books, the Tracker magazine, all of the research. Name every serious author, James Lewis, every serious author who has ever written things. That's the source material from which you impart information about all of these great builders, Roosevelt, Barrington, Voti. You know the list.
I do. I do. Yeah. Yeah. What are your fondest memories of attending OHS conventions?
Well, the very first one that I went to was a very early reaction to the slideshow. The first convention I attended was 1969 in Manhattan and Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember a very young Rollin Smith playing a recital at New York Avenue Methodist, which was an early electric action organ. Hutchings, maybe, I'm not sure. And then I began to attend other conventions as they happened. It's been my great honor to play some programs at Severance Hall in Cleveland, Immaculate Conception in Boston, Worcester. Remember playing a recital at All Saints in Worcester, in which a piece by Merrill Kenneth Wolfe was premiered. He was a regular attendee at the OHS conventions, and he wrote variations on a Victorian hymn, which I remember playing there. He was very into the OHS. Another person who is no longer with us.
Right.
It's about I would have to, go off into the attic, see how many of those programs I might have saved.
Right. Yeah. I'm sure there's a lot in our archive. I'm sure we have.
Yes. Well, I should come to Villanova.
You should. Well, you're always welcome. You're always welcome.
Yeah.
And you were awarded this Distinguished Service Award in 2010.
Right. I remember that was presented to me when I played a recital at Rose City College.
Oh.
I think the convention was based in Pittsburgh.
Okay.
But they went to Grove City because the recently restored Kimball in the chapel, for Manuel Kimball, they wanted to feature that. I believe it was Michael Barone who presented it to me. I don't want to be wrong on that, but yes, and I'm, needless to say, very grateful for that recognition. But I have to say, at the same time, I can think of all of the people who have volunteered over the years in dozens of ways.
Yes.
To make the Oregon Historical Society flourish, to widen and deepen its scope and scholarship. And I think what I have done, I did, with great pleasure. I'm not so sure that I could look at it at that and say, "Look what I did." I don't think so.
Yeah.
But I'm grateful for it.
We are really fortunate to have, a whole group of volunteers still who are helping to push forward the mission of the OHS. Yeah.
Well, I mean, a name that we haven't mentioned so far, Alan Hoffman.
Oh, right, of course.
Yeah.
And then fast forward to 2019 when you came to our headquarters in Villanova, PA, and played on the Aeolian Skinner there.
Right. Yes. And
what was that like for you?
Well, of course, that organ is a residence organ. The pipes of it are all in the cellar.
Yeah.
But it has an interesting pedigree because the contract was signed with Aeolian, and yet Aeolian went out of business or was merged into Aeolian
Skinner.
So Aeolian Skinner finished it with its own office number, and it's an interesting organ, very interesting. It can be played with the role player.
Yes. Yeah.
And coming back to Roland Smith, it seems to me that he played that day. Of course, it was a 2 or 3 day conference.
Yeah. Symposium. Yeah.
Yeah, he played some of the roles. I also remember that Alan Morrison brought some students from Curtis.
Right.
And I believe that I sort of collaborated with John Schwantz in coaching some of them as they played that organ.
Yeah. Yeah. You did a master class there. I don't remember that. Yeah. That was great. So now what would you like to see the OHS become, or how do you see us growing into the future? What are your hopes and dreams for the OHS?
Well, that's really complicated. It requires a crystal ball, which I have never invested in. But there are so many strengths, and the strengths of the past, both far past but also recent, can and should be an inspiration for the way it heads. You've entered a new age with having a facility, the house. I think we were talking a moment ago about organs that may not survive for a variety of reasons. I think of all of the archival material and how it was frequently just in a warehouse.
Right. It's not long.
Yeah, yeah. It is now at headquarters.
Yeah.
And the firms, like I'm thinking Moeller, for example, who produced thousands upon thousands. I mean, they got up into 5-digit opus numbers.
I know. I've seen all the boxes.
Yeah. Where is it going to go? It might, in an ideal world, it would all be under the aegis of OHS. It takes space. It's heavy.
Yeah. Yeah. We have an offsite repository where all of the Moeller files are, along with Reuter.
Yeah.
We have moved SD to the house because it's not, and Barbara Owen's material is coming up soon.
Yeah. Archival material. There was a time when I was still in Newburyport that the Boston chapter of the American Guild of Organists was busy establishing an organ library. And for a while, it was at, I think, the School of Theology at Boston University. But there was a period there where certain key people whose collection of valuable materials had passed or were they were departing this life. Ed Gammons, Edward Flint, E. Power Biggs. And Barbara said, we need temporary spaces to keep this safe. Some of those things lived under my piano in Newburyport. And then in due course, they were taken where? Princeton?
Well, we do have a number of boxes of E. Power Biggs material in our offsite repository, and they're on a 99-year loan from the Boston chapter.
Oh, well, that's interesting. And I did not know that. But there was a place that was an interim place, something in Princeton.
Oh, at Westminster Choir College.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Some of it went there.
Right.
From under my piano.
Right. Right.
And these things are irreplaceable.
Just as we sort of come to the end of our conversation here, in your memory and your experience, what is the importance of having an OHS convention? Why have an OHS convention?
Well, it's always been to hear the instruments, so you naturally you want to go back to some places where there were wonderful experiences, and you're going back to Milwaukee. I think that's really important for those who want to hear these organs used in concert. The E. Power Biggs Fellowship is important. that interfaces well with the conventions. And it's not just organists who have been winners of that. I remember the year when Pat Murphy was a winner of the Davis.
He was one of the first.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Entered the field of organ building and has done wonderful work. I think they are important. I suppose, I think we've already seen this, that the repertoire of organs that we consider important has enlarged. It has included the 20th century builders, and I think that's important too. In the beginning, there weren't so many opportunities on the West Coast. But you've been to Seattle. Forgive my ignorance, but did the OHS ever go to LA?
No, but that is on our list.
Yeah. Well, go quickly because there are interesting things that might not be there tomorrow.
Right.
I think of Emmanuel Presbyterian. That organ is still intact.
Yep.
Opus 676, 1928 was the contract. It was one of the first ones, but certainly the first one in LA, which means, of course, Southern California, to incorporate some of G. Donald Harrison's upper work.
Oh, okay.
And Clarence Maynard told me that the organist fraternity, when that organ was debuted, thought that it was just way too extreme. It was much too great. It was too shrill. And we look at it now,
right.
and you say, yum, yum.
Yeah, right. Well, Tom, it's been a real pleasure to chat with you about your career and your association with the OHS. Really appreciate your time, and it's great to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure.